Wherever Joe Biden goes these days, whether it be the Capitol for his State of the Union address or a late-night appearance at 30 Rock, it seems that pro-Palestine protesters and genocide Joe posters are bound to follow as the president continues to arm Israel in its brutal assault on Gaza. But these protests aren't just taking place outside of his motorcade. No, the call is also coming from inside the house. Literally. Yes, since early on in the war, the Biden White House has been facing some very public criticisms from their very own staffers. You might recall in November when over 400 Biden administration staffers signed an open letter calling on the president to demand a ceasefire, with one of the staffers telling NBC News that many of them felt they were, quote, a part of something that is actively harming their loved ones. That same month, 100 State Department and international development officials signed a memo in a White House dissent channel criticizing the administration for, quote, disregarding the lives of Palestinians and spreading misinformation about the war. And just the other week, over 20 Biden administration lawyers signed on to a letter arguing that Israel has indeed violated international and domestic American law and that continuing to send weapons to Israel would be illegal. But the biggest displays of dissent have not been from the staffers trying to change policy from within. No, instead it's the growing list of officials who have decided to resign over Biden's war policy, who would rather say goodbye to their jobs than continue working for an administration that is aiding and abetting Israel's deadly war on Gaza. Now, they may not be able to use the White House dissent channels anymore, but they can see what happens when they express that dissent freely and publicly. And for the first time, several of them join me now together to do just that. Tariq Habash resigned in January and was a top advisor at Biden's education department, specifically working with higher education. He was the first and is the only Palestinian-American official to have publicly resigned over Gaza. Annelle Sheline is an Arabic speaker with a PhD in Middle East politics and served as a foreign affairs officer in the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor. She resigned over the war in March. And Hala Rharrit was a diplomat for the State Department and most recently served as the deputy director of the Dubai Media Hub. She resigned this past month after spending almost 2 decades with the US State Department. Thank you all for joining me on the show today on Mehdi Unfiltered. Annelle, let me start with you. You were at the State Department. You specifically worked on promoting human rights in the Middle East. What was it like to do that job in the midst of this Gaza conflict?
It became really impossible because not only were members of civil society that were previously willing to work with the US government on issues of freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, everything that the State Department documents every year in the human rights reports, they no longer wanted to have anything to do with the US government. Or those that were willing to engage, they just wanted to talk about Gaza. Whereas they themselves were still dealing with very real repression and danger coming from their authoritarian governments, where they reside and try to push against. So unfortunately, it just over time became clear that what exactly was our office supposed to do? And once the human rights reports came out, which they were finally released, they did come out last month. It was unclear to me what exactly my office was going to be able to do.
And that's when you decided you got to leave.
I did. I sort of waited for the human rights reports to be completed. I didn't want to leave the team with that additional work, and then completed my year's obligation to the government and left.
Tariq, you mentioned in your resignation letter that the Biden administration loves to boast about having one of the most diverse administrations ever. So as a Palestinian-American, did you feel that your perspective and the perspectives of other Arab American officials was actually welcome within the administration, was actually taken seriously?
I think the personal aspect was listened to, but I don't think it was ever actually something that was internalized, was considered in a policy sense. And I think that really undermined the administration's ability to address what was happening holistically and use its diverse representation as a strength. I think that we as an administration were supposed to represent and reflect what America really looks like. And I think that, by ignoring that voice, ignoring the representation of Arab and Muslim and Palestinian voices on Gaza, it undermined the administration's ability to actually hear from real Americans too, who overwhelmingly are saying, we need a ceasefire now. We need to de-escalate the violence. Military is not like the actual way to peace here. It's not a successful policy solution. And after over 7 months, we've seen that play out. And I think that's largely been accurate.
And Hala, you've said that when you were in the administration, you were, quote, ostracized for your views on Gaza. Can you tell us more about that?
I was indeed. So Mehdi, as you mentioned, my last role was as spokesperson. So immediately, shortly after October 7th, well, first of all, on October 7th, obviously we were monitoring what was happening, and we were all devastated what we were seeing on that day. And we were trying to determine as spokespeople when would be the right time and go and amplify any statements coming out of Washington after such an event. So we waited. Usually we would wait until things calm down, and then we, as foreign language spokespeople, go out. But shortly after the invasion, we saw such intense mass killings on the Gaza side that I wrote back to Washington immediately, and I said, I can't use these talking points to the Arab world because they were so heavy, especially early on Israel has a right to defend itself, which, yes, understood, but they completely negated the Palestinian situation, what was happening in Gaza on the ground, and what we were also hearing as spokespeople from Arab journalists. So early on, I said I will not include these talking points, not because I don't agree with it, but because I'm seeing the backlash that it's causing across the Arab world. Increased anti-Americanism. Nothing we were saying was convincing people. It was just inciting people. So obviously that was not very favorable for many that I work with. Some came to defense, but some definitely silenced me and sidelined me.
So I'm intrigued by this idea that you're all within the administration from different perspectives. Obviously, you're there because you want to be there. No one's forced you to go work in this government. You're there and you're seeing stuff happening in real time. Annelle, a lot of us across the world, across America, are looking at Instagram videos coming out of Gaza over the last 7 months. People are seeing horrific scenes. Are people in government seeing those scenes? What are the I'm fascinated. In your office, did people come in the morning and say, I just saw horrific stuff on my phone, like we all do in our lives?
Yes. I mean, I can only speak for kind of, people in my office and my sort of narrow window, but it was certainly something people were very concerned about. And there were ongoing conversations, of kind of internal discussion, some of these affinity groups of people just saying, I don't know how much longer I can continue to show up to my job. But it is, a question I've gotten really often is why haven't there been more public resignations? It's such an honor to get to be here with my fellow resignees. But why aren't there more of us? And, I do think for many people it is, just a basic question of financial considerations, but it's also this belief in the work that they're doing and the fear that if they were no longer on the inside, that they would feel even more ineffectual, that to sort of try and join the protesters, yelling at the motorcade is having less of an effect than to try to stay where they are. But I do think, over time, it really just does become a question of side.
I mean, Tariq, you resigned early on. How many weeks into this conflict did you resign?
I think that I initiated the process just probably 6-7 weeks, but I actually didn't publicly resign until January. So
and we're now
3 months.
7 months, more than 7 months into this. What would you say to a colleague who's still in government who calls you and says, Tariq, what do I do?
I mean, it's a personal decision. I never want anyone to feel pressured, but at the same time, I was a political appointee. I had the secretary's ear. I had opportunities to speak with National Security Council, Domestic Policy Council regularly. It was very clear that there was no point where our voices, our expertise, our policy perspective, our lived experience was going to impact in any way what was happening in the region. And so for me personally, it was so important to be clear, both as a representative of the administration, as a Democrat, and as an American, to use my voice to say, listen, this is bad for America. This isn't in our American interests. It doesn't align with our American values. That was a message that I think was really critical for the president to hear, and I don't think that it's really resonated.
You worked in the Department of Education.
Yeah.
Unlike Hala and Annelle, who are in the State Department. It's interesting, if you were in the Department of Education right now, you would still be dealing with a Palestine story, which is the campus protests.
Yeah.
What would you be saying now, watching this brutal militarized response to what are mostly 97%, 98% peaceful protests? Where's the education department when it comes to this issue?
just to be clear, we were dealing with this while I was there. And part of the reason why I felt like even on the work that I was responsible for, I couldn't have a substantive impact, it was because there were being orders drawn by the White House. It was the National Security Council calling the shots on what the Education Department could do or could say, even in the context of the educational work that was happening and how we were talking about protecting students, protecting academic freedom, protecting free speech. Like, all of this stuff is intertwined. So when people say, oh, this is a foreign policy issue, the Education Department doesn't have any authority here, I actually think that the intersectional aspects of this work that we're doing, it's so important to recognize this affects us here at home just as much as it does abroad, and without being able to reconcile those two things, you are going to continue to have failed policy.
Hala, as a Dubai-based diplomat, you obviously had a pretty good pulse on how the Arab world has been feeling since October the 7th, how nations will continue to react to US foreign policy. How much, in your view, has the US destroyed any little credibility it had left in that part of the world? Is this an Iraq-level event in terms of the burning down of America's reputation in the Middle East?
I think it's worse than Iraq. And that's what I was documenting. To answer your question as well, Mehdi, about did folks in Washington see the same images? I know they did because I sent it to them. That was my role when I did not do interviews. I was monitoring pan-Arab media, traditional pan-Arab media and social pan-Arab media. And I would write daily reports back to Washington to very senior officials that would review it on a daily basis. That's what I was documenting, what was happening, as well as the U.S. pictures that were going viral of U.S.-made bombs that would say USA, and then would show the children that were killed by those bombs. And my insistence to Washington over all of those months is that this militaristic policy is a danger to our own national security. Amplifying these talking points across the Arab world is having a backlash, and it's instigating people to hate us even more because they see our dehumanizing language towards the Palestinians, that not even the good things that we were doing, for example, related to humanitarian assistance, was being well received, and our credibility was destroyed. And one of the points that I made back to Washington, which I monitored across those months, is that even the quote-unquote liberal Arabs, the ones who always admired us, despite all of the political issues, no longer had faith in us. And that was devastating as a diplomat that worked in that part of the world for almost 20 years.
So, Annelle, Hala mentioned the US-made bombs dropping, right, saying USA on them. Joe Biden paused one arms shipment last week. This week, the administration announced they are going to approve another $1 billion almost of tank ammo and other munitions. Benjamin Netanyahu said, well, we don't need this. Israel can stand alone. We can do this on our own. Does America, this is a fundamental question in our politics right now, does America have the economic, political, and military leverage to stop this conflict tomorrow?
Absolutely, 100%. And we've seen admissions of that from Israeli military officials. We saw evidence of that in previous conflicts, probably most notably when Reagan stopped the Israeli assault on Lebanon. This is now decades ago. It's been a very long time since a U.S. president actually used that leverage, unfortunately. But I do think that, it's very clear we saw the immense reaction and outcry when the administration paused even that single shipment. And this was treated as such a huge deal. And there was such an outcry of, from sort of the Zionist establishment. And so, clearly the pausing of the single shipment was not an indication of a policy shift. As you said, we just saw $1 billion in new munitions, and this notion that the U.S. would be unable to shift Israeli policy here. I mean, in the past, the Israeli government has actually often relied on the U.S. to come in and say, all right, that's enough, because they know politically it can be difficult for the Israeli government to rein itself in, given what we've observed, from the Israeli citizenry, who we've seen blocking aid convoys, burning food aid, Palestinians on social media. Again, this notion that the U.S. is powerless here. I mean, the U.S. could turn off the flow of weapons tomorrow. Certainly Israel has weapons in its stockpile, but it's going through them very quickly. And Israel would have to very quickly think about what sort of deterrence are we able to maintain against, concerns about Hezbollah, against Iran. They would absolutely have to rethink their approach. And Biden could do this with a single phone call, simply the threat that this would happen. And yet what we're seeing instead, at least for what I've observed at the State Department, we do hear the talking points made. They are bringing these talking points to Bibi, but there is no use of the leverage whatsoever. And there's just this sort of blind unwillingness to recognize the U.S. does.
Yeah.
And so, this notion that it's not really the United States' fault. It is absolutely the fault of the U.S. government.
And Tariq, you mentioned earlier about, we were listened to, but it wasn't internalized.
Yeah.
Do they actually care? Mother Jones did a big piece early on in the conflict on Joe Biden and his kind of roots on this issue, his support for Zionism, his support for Israel going back decades in the Senate. And there was a line from a former official in the administration that said, he's known for his empathy, but there's one group of people he doesn't seem to be empathetic for. You are a Palestinian-American who served in the Biden administration as a political appointee. Is that how you felt? Is that the impression you got?
Yeah. Absolutely. After months of trying to communicate with the president, with other people in the administration who were representing the president on these policies, it very much felt like there was an exception for Palestinians in terms of his empathy. And that's really difficult to really untangle when you sweat, bled, you stayed up endless nights to enact the president's policies, volunteering to support the campaign because Trump is still an existential threat. There's no question about all those things. But when your own humanity is questioned or there are exceptions made because you are Palestinian, it makes you second guess why you're doing the work that you're doing.
And Hala, Annelle talked about military leverage, but we often overlook the diplomatic role that the US plays protecting Israel at the UN Security Council, for example, in other international institutions. I wonder how you felt as a State Department spokesperson, listening or watching the US ambassador to the United Nations, a fellow woman of color, raising her hand to veto resolutions calling for a ceasefire. In fact, recently the US and the UK blocked an Algerian resolution to investigate mass graves in Gaza. How did that make you feel, working in the State Department, seeing what was happening at the UN, for example?
Honestly, Mehdi, I felt horror. I felt embarrassment. And I felt sadness that my country was insisting on violating our own values, violating our own principles that I worked to defend for 18 years. And it was honestly very difficult to face peers for if they would act very straightforward, even off record. They would ask, I thought your country stood for something. Why are you continuously opposing even the Palestinian statehood at the United Nations? And we really had no good answers. And obviously, eventually it led me to resign. But I can say that we would have internal conversations among diplomats, and people would walk in the next morning and they would just cringe. They're so frustrated by the insistence of not recognizing the situation in Gaza.
Final question to all of you. Tariq mentioned that Trump is an existential threat to American democracy. He's obviously horrible on the issue of Israel-Palestine. He's said that, he's criticized Biden even for pausing one arms shipment. But after your own experiences in the Biden administration, do you plan to vote for Joe Biden in 2024?
I think he could still win my vote, I think, if he shifted policy. Like I said, the U.S. has a massive amount of power here, and there's still time. I think if the United States worked in a real way to flood Gaza with aid, to impose a ceasefire, to work towards the creation of a state of Palestine, then I would very happily vote for Joe Biden.
None of which seems to be coming soon. Tariq.
Listen, Mehdi, what I will say is that it's the president's policies that are on the ballot. What I'll say is that the president has talked about how Trump is an existential threat, not just to Americans, but to American democracy, to our institutions. But what we've seen in the last 7 months is that the president isn't particularly interested in hearing the voices and the will of the American people and internalizing that into policy change. What we're seeing is that he is fine with the repression of academic freedom and freedom of speech on college campuses. And what he is instilling through his policies is not much different from what Trump has already done and has said he would do. If the president wants to win back voters, particularly the voters of a younger generation that is more progressive, more diverse than we've ever seen in America, it is his obligation to change his policies to reflect what his base really wants to see, which is a ceasefire, which is peace,
and if he doesn't,
and if he doesn't, then he's risking losing voters.
Hala, last word.
I can just say, Mehdi, that I've served under Democratic and Republican president. 18 years ago, I joined under Bush, Obama, Trump. Never did I think, even during the Trump administration, I'll never consider resigning. And I'll tell you why. There was always room for discussion within the department. As a diplomat, all diplomats felt like they could contribute. Their voices were heard. I've never felt helpless or hopeless until this time, which led me to my resignation. So I'm not quite over it. So it would be hard for me to give my vote to Biden at the moment, but I want to be hopeful, like Annelle as well, and say he still has a chance to turn things around and admit that militaristic policy has been an absolute failure, and he needs to end it and return to diplomacy at the moment, right away.
We will have to leave it there. Hala Rharrit, Annelle Sheline, Tariq Habash, thank you all for joining me on the show today, and thank you all for doing what you did.